In this video, we're going to go through the classification of materials according to their mechanical response to loading. The first type of classification is according to linearity. If, when a load is applied, the deformation is directly related to the load, the relationship is linear, then we call this material linear. Otherwise, if the relationship does not follow a straight line between the load and the deformation, we call this material a nonlinear material. It is very important to not confuse linearity with elasticity. According to the energy dissipation, if loading and unloading follow the same curve, that means there is no energy dissipated in loading the material, then this material is called elastic. On the other hand, if loading and unloading follow different paths, then the material is non-elastic. In these types of material, a lot of energy is put through loading of the material, through the loading path, and this energy is lost when the material is unloaded. This energy is lost in the form of heat, or in the form of damage of the material, or in the form of plastic deformation or residual deformation in the material. We can also classify the material response according to direction or material symmetries. In the cube shown here, if a specimen is taken in this direction 1, or a specimen is taken from direction 2, or a specimen is taken from direction 3, and then I load and observe the deformation, if the three different specimens give me the same response, then I call this material isotropic. If, on the other hand, different directions give me different response, for example here the specimen in the direction 1 gives me this response, direction 2 gives me another response, and direction 3 gives me a different response, then I call it anisotropic material. To further classify the types of anisotropic materials, we need to understand what does it mean when we say material symmetric response. The material on the left hand side is symmetric around the plane shown because when I load it across this plane, the response is symmetric around that plane. This is called a symmetry plane of the material. On the other hand, the material on the right, when I pull on it perpendicular to the red plane, even though the load is symmetric around this plane, you notice that the response is not symmetric. We're getting a shear response. This is not a plane of symmetry for the material. Based on this, we can further classify anisotropic materials as follows. Generally anisotropic, orthotropic materials that possess three planes of material symmetry, or transversely isotropic materials which are symmetric along an axis that is normal to a transverse plane of isotropy. For example, the material on the left, if it's made out of an isotropic material with three different families of fibers oriented perpendicular to each other, and if the three families of fibers have different properties, then this material becomes an orthotropic material, because the response is symmetric around each plane perpendicular to those fibers. On the other hand, the material on the right, if it's made out of anisotropic material with a family of fibers oriented in one direction, then this family of fibers will change the response in this direction. The response in this direction will be different from the response perpendicular to the direction of the fibers. This material is transversely isotropic, and during the lecture we're going to go through examples of orthotropic materials and transversely isotropic materials. The next type of classification is according to homogeneity. A material is homogeneous if the response to load is independent of where I take the specimen from. So for example, if I take specimen 1, specimen 2, or specimen 3, and I load each specimen and record the deformation, I get the same deformation. This is called a homogeneous material. On the other hand, if taking specimens from different parts of the material will give different response to loading, this is considered a non-homogeneous material. The last classification is whether the response to mechanical loading is time-dependent or not. If, for a particular material, the load versus deformation curve of that material is independent of the speed of loading, if I load with a speed v1, v2, or v3, I get the same response. This is called a non-viscous material. If, on the other hand, the response to loading is dependent on the speed of the application of load, for example, for a slow application of load I get a certain response, the higher the load, the stiffer the material, this is called a viscous material. There are two examples of viscous response that are very important for civil engineers. The first one is stress relaxation under constant strain, and the second one is creep under constant stress. Stress relaxation is the phenomenon of the material losing stress when the strain is kept constant. So the strain is kept constant, but the stress inside that material decreases with the passage of time. Creep, on the other hand, is the increase in the strain without a change in the stress. So when the stress is held constant and the strain just keeps increasing with the passage of time, then this is the phenomenon of creep.